traditionally surrounded by. In their participation in his class discussion, for example, he and his mates were often uncontrollably over-exuberant. However, in case we're tempted to read him as a radical, it's also worth noting that Hanif's teachers were often very receptive to his transgressive enthusiasms, and he was widely recognised as the star pupil. So there's actually quite a good reason for seeing his unconventional vernacularisation of schoolwork in Extract 1 as the product of his position at the top of the hierarchy in Class 9A, supported by the dominant local order rather than opposed to it. And indeed, we could go on from there, if we wanted, if we had time, we could go on from there to talk about the school itself and locate the school itself in a much longer history of struggle over multi-ethnic comprehensive education and the status of different languages. We won't do that. Instead, looking sideways to other instances of exaggerated posh and cockney, the first thing to note is that this kind of stylization was actually rather common, occurring once every 45 minutes, about once every 45 minutes in my 37 hours of data. About half of these performances responded to processes of stratification and division associated with schooling. As in Extract 1, both posh and cockney were quite often stylized in the transitions between work and play, and ultra posh was also used when kids felt patronized by teachers. I mean, teacher treats you like a baby and you treat him like a very stuck-up person by saying, for example. Okay. In addition, away from the kind of demarcations and rankings involved in schooling, hyper-cockney and posh were also quite extensively used in humour and mockery among the kids themselves. In fact, pulling together the connotations that I found in about 20 episodes, cockney seemed to be associated with vigour, passion, and bodily laxity, while posh got linked to physical weakness, social distance, constraint, and sexual inhibition. In all, I looked at about 50 episodes, and it certainly took a lot of time to analyse each episode. For much of the time, I worked to the aesthetic of slowness and smallness that David Silverman associates with conversation analysis, squeezing out the kind of interactional detail illustrated in Extract 1. But I was also very interested in how these episodes figured within both biographical and institutional processes, and so in the end, like a lot of linguistic ethnography, my account also covers both individuals and institutions, even though it's situated interaction that holds the central place. Well, so what? Okay, the account might look quite convincing, might seem quite satisfying aesthetically as a piece of kind of layered ethnographic description, but is that it? Well, obviously, of course not. And this is one of the moments where wider public and academic discourses become relevant. Overall, there's material here for case study engagement with a number of debates about social class. But maybe the most obvious link, beyond the obvious link from my data to wider issues, is to claims made about class, social class, identity transformation in late modernity. Looking across my data set as a whole, pulling together all the themes and images evoked in the situated stylizations of posh and cockney, pulling together all the kind of that imagery, you could make out a kind of overarching imprint of a set of kind of high-low, mind-body, reason and emotion binaries that reach back to the emergence of bourgeois society in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, when you consider that this wasn't a traditional white working class school, when you remember that the pupils in this school came from all over London about a third were from refugee and asylum-seeking families, that less than a quarter of Hanif's class were white, and that Hanif himself spoke to his parents mostly in Sylheti. In short, when you consider the globalized, multi-ethnic, late modern environment, then these kids' insistent reproduction of a very traditional class imagery contradicts the view that class is losing its salience, particularly among contemporary urban youth. Maybe more profoundly, if we bring the imagery these kids had at their fingertips, if we bring that together with the asymmetrical situations in which they spontaneously stylize posh and cockney, then I think we have a graphical, empirical picture of what Raymond Williams calls class hegemony, the saturation of the whole process of living by the dominance and subordination of particular classes. What the analysis shows, in short, is that even though these kids didn't talk explicitly about social class, their everyday practical consciousness was deeply impregnated with the sensibilities we traditionally associate with social class. Okay, now, to conclude this presentation, I'd like to try and bring my account of linguistic ethnography closer to home, maybe. First of all, locating it in the late modern epistemic environment that all of us inhabit. And second, try and kind of point out the relevance by showing ways of accommodating linguistic ethnography in different studies. So now I'm on to section 3, contexts for linguistic ethnography. Now, there's a general feeling nowadays that the world's more fragmented, less coherent, less predictable than it used to be, and that social categories like class, gender and ethnicity are much harder to use now than they used to be. What is the working class today? Asks Paul Gilroy. What gender is it? What colour is it? How, in the light of its obvious segmentation, is it to be unified? And obviously, anti-essentialist critiques have generated lots of trouble for traditional notions of ethnicity and gender as well. Now that, it seems to me, is one point where the epistemological commitments in ethnography come into play. Ethnography is partly defined by its commitment to taking a long, hard look at empirical processes that make no sense in established frameworks. And if right now we're experiencing a period where traditional frameworks are actually looking a lot less well established than they used to be, then ethnography is one option to turn to. Turning from the ethnography half of linguistic ethnography to the linguistic, there are also productive links to social constructionism and the view that everyday activity is actually rather consequential for the production of social reality. If the social world gets reproduced and created anew in the plethora of specific activities that make up our routine lives, then it's not just ethnography that's useful for the purchase it gives us on the lived and the local. To see how realities get proposed, ratified, resisted and reworked, we need to look at communication. And to do a good job with that, it helps to have the tools of linguistic, semiotic discourse and interaction analysis. So, does that mean that everyone should now go off and turn themselves into ethnographic linguists? No, it doesn't. Okay. And I'm not claiming that linguistic ethnography holds monopoly rights to the kinds of perspective I've described. Participant observation in non-linguistic ethnography provides another route, and so does first-hand experience in everyday life. Even so, if you're interested in the countless ways in which people reproduce, nuance and refuse established social relations and identities, if you're interested in that, then for pinning it down and starting to separate the elements, linguistic ethnography can be rather useful.